Housing is unaffordable for half of all renters. That's according to the Minnesota Housing Partnership's latest report. Renters are also more cost burdened now than at any other point in the last decade. Housing instability is on the rise as well, with evictions in Minnesota increasing by 44% compared to pre-COVID levels. Joining me now is Senator Lindsey Port, who says housing is a key priority for her this session. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So this is not your first time on the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Committee. What is it about this topic that speaks to you?
Yeah, I think when I think about housing, I see it as the foundation for everything else. If you don't have stable housing, everything else gets harder. We have lower economic possibilities, we have worse educational outcomes, we have worse health outcomes. So stable housing is really the key for every family in Minnesota. And I think that's the other piece about it. There's not a lot of policy that we work on in this state that literally affects every single person's life, but housing does. So it is across all communities, it is across all types of people. It really is just the cornerstone.
Yeah, and we know that housing is also not an issue unique to Minnesota, but what are some of the challenges that are unique to our state?
Yeah, in Minnesota, we have sort of a slightly different ecosystem than a lot of other states. We have a great combination of for-profit and nonprofit housing providers. We also have a housing finance agency that is really invested in our state and has been able to be sort of more creative than a lot of other states just because of the way that we built it and that we connected it to our legislature. A lot of states don't actually connect their housing finance agency to their legislature, so it allows us to be partners, which is great. But we also have areas of the state that really have huge opportunity for economic investment. Northern Minnesota, for instance, we have a lot of great companies up there, Polaris, DigiKey, but they can't provide housing to expand. So we are really a state that has the ability to grow, except we don't have housing.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit more about that. You know, we know there is a shortage of homes. Why?
You know, it's a sort of a long, complicated history of housing in this whole country. The federal government really in the 60s and 70s, and especially the 80s, sharply cut investments in housing. And that was not something that the state could just make up the difference for. So we had to rely on nonprofits and for-profit businesses to come into the space and invest, which is just harder. And then over the last years since the pandemic, we've seen just so much instability in people's jobs, in people's health, and that all, again, trickles down to housing. Rents have continued to go up and up and up over the last 20 years, where wages have stayed relatively flat, which means housing just every year gets slightly more out of reach for Minnesotans.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. You know, in 2023, you authored a bill providing a historic $1 billion investment in Minnesota housing. But in a recent meeting, Minnesota Housing said there is still a need even now. Can you talk to me about the difference in those needs, the needs we saw before and the needs we're seeing now?
Absolutely. We spent a good chunk of the money during the pandemic keeping people housed. We had federal funds that came in to help us with that. But just keeping people in their homes during the pandemic was the critical need. There wasn't the ability for people to really move a lot, and we just needed to keep them stable. Since that time, we really have seen the need for more units. It's been slowly building over the last 4 decades, and now has reached a point where we're over 100,000 units short, which is a huge number. So when we invested $1 billion, it was an incredible step. One of my proudest moments in this legislature was seeing us actually make that big investment. But the reality is, in a normal year, housing is 0.03% of the state budget, which is just nowhere near what we actually need. When you think of the fact that it really affects every single person in Minnesota, to have it be such a small percentage of our budget means that it's going to take years and years and years for us to catch up. The other thing about investments in housing, particularly in production, is they don't happen overnight. You know, we invested almost half of that money into production of new units, but that's going to take several years for us to actually see that investment come to fruition, because it just takes time to build houses.
Yeah. So you mentioned the budget and what a small part housing gets. This is a budget year, but there is a deficit looming on the horizon.
Yeah.
So what do you think we can do with housing in that budget space?
I think there are a couple of things. First, we can look at policy that can remove some of the barriers that are in place for us actually building more units. But secondly, even with a challenging budget sort of space, I would say that what we heard in MMB's budget forecast overview was part of the reason that revenues are down in Minnesota is because people are spending too much of their income on housing and healthcare. So I think if we look at deciding not to make investments in housing in this challenging period, we're only exacerbating the problem. We can make, even modest investments to continue to keep people stably housed during this time.
Last session, you put forth ideas, bipartisan housing policies that ultimately failed, with critics saying one size fits all doesn't work in Minnesota.
Yep.
And I know work was done during the interim to look at those challenges and address them. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. We spent a lot of time in this interim. Myself and Chair Howard over in the House worked with all of the stakeholders, not just the folks who were bringing ideas to us for zoning reform, but with the folks who had concerns too. Cities and counties across the state. We spent many, many, many hours in meetings discussing the different proposals and how we can sort of streamline things to be a little bit more strategic, and I would say go in with a scalpel instead of a bulldozer, and see if we can find ways that really do reduce costs. And I think being able to look at it in that way, what are the barriers to getting starter homes built? I think that's one of our key questions. We haven't seen starter homes built in Minnesota in years. And young people and seniors who are looking to downsize need that kind of housing. So we're really sort of focusing in, and it has been bipartisan every step of the way. I think as we get these bills finished up and introduce them, you'll see an incredible coalition of organizations and also legislators that we might not work on anything else together ever through our legislative career, but this is a space that we found common ground.
Well, that's great that you have that bipartisan support. What do you think it will help you accomplish on this topic this session?
I think it's really going to change the narrative. I think we've been able to sort of circle in on what the real barriers are and how we can address them. And I think because we have such a broad, interesting coalition, that it's going to collect some notice. And I think that we've done the work now to really show the cities that we are working in good faith, and they have spent time at the table with us. So I think we'll be able to move through this process, not necessarily agreeing on every step, but being able to work together.
What are some of those challenges you're anticipating?
I think cities, as we do as the legislature, we don't like it when the governor tells us what to do. Cities don't like it when the state tells them what to do, and we understand that. I think one of the big changes is we've been able to focus this conversation on the needs of the communities. And we've been able to really bring cities in, bring in mayors and city councilors to talk about the actual things that stop housing from being built. And I think it's really opened the door for both sides to have new conversations about how we can actually make those changes.
Senator, is there anything else you'd like to say on this issue?
I think just a reminder that housing is the foundation for all of us. And when we can focus the conversation around those human needs of housing, it's something that everybody understands. And I think it can be a place where, in what might be a challenging legislative session, we can find real common ground.
Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.